Okay, let's start. And most welcome all of you to this seminar. We are very happy to have all the Nordic countries represented here today. And that's not very common, I would say. So very welcome all of you. And I will shortly ask you for a presentation because Martha, of course, do not know all of you, although she has met a few of us during her days here since she came June 2nd. And I'm sure that you have all read something about Professor Martha Feynman, so I should not give a complete introduction, I think. And I am sure that a lot of you are interested in this vulnerability project that Martha has started and has elaborated on in various of subjects, including family law, child rights, queer theory, feminist theory, and so on, I would say. And we will hear a lot about that. And very welcome to you, Martha. We're very happy to have you here with the faculty.
Well, I'm going to thank you all for coming, and I'm really excited to hear your responses to what I'm going to talk about today. What I thought I'd do is a little bit of an intellectual journey, my intellectual journey from concepts of equality to my theorizing about vulnerability. And I actually wrote everything out. I did that partly so I didn't forget anything, but also because it'll slow me down. I tend to talk really fast. So I'm going to try and slow myself down by sticking to the text. I began my legal theory work in family law. That's what I started off doing. And I developed in that context the idea of a gendered life. The idea of a gendered life arose from my perception that in spite of attempts to introduce egalitarian principles into the family and into family law, the family remained the most gendered institution in American society, and that was in spite of decades of feminist attempts. And to some extent, I'm still trying to understand why this is the case 30 years later. So after 30 years of a career struggling with concepts of equality, I still see the family as incredibly gendered. Now, in my generation, we were called the second wave feminists, and we participated in 3 political and social revolutions that took place in mid-20th century America, and this really shaped how I feel about equality and actually led to the theorizing about vulnerability. These revolutions really transformed how Americans think about themselves and how we think about our fundamental or basic institutions. Many legal issues arose in the wake of those revolutions, and some of those legal issues remain today unresolved. Other legal issues are still contested, and there are new claims that continue to unfold, again, in the wake of these 3 revolutions. The first revolution was the claiming of civil and political rights on the part of Americans that had been excluded from many aspects of life, opening up workplaces, education, and public spaces for those that were previously excluded on the basis of things like their race or their gender. This revolution involved a demand for the end to discrimination and exclusion, so that the problem was seen as exclusion and the solution to that problem was seen as inclusion. This area of change addressed the so-called public sphere of life, and today other groups seek access and acceptance much the same way that people did in terms of race and gender earlier. So we see disability rights emerging, protections against discrimination based on sexual orientation, and most recently, assertions of rights based on immigrant status. That's become increasingly significant. Next. The second revolution was, of course, the sexual revolution. which heralded in the acceptance of sex outside marriage for women as well as for men. So it was always accepted as a norm, an expectation for men, but not for women. And in the wake of the sexual revolution, of course, a lot of legal rights or legal questions arose involving things like reproductive rights. Plus, we had a great number of reforms in the United States pushing for the elimination of stigma for reproduction outside of the institution of marriage. We argued for the removal of use of terms such as illegitimate to describe children who were born outside of the institution of marriage, and those children were, of course, discriminated against because they were, quote, illegitimate. We argued for repeal of legal disadvantages associated with the status of illegitimacy. The legal changes included opening up public benefits to unmarried couples and the removal of criminal penalties on fornication and non-marital cohabitation and other kinds of sexual crimes, adultery. And they all used to be criminalized in the United States, and in fact there were prosecutions well into the 1980s and even the 1990s under some of these statutes. So eventually, non-marital sex and reproduction became, at least in some communities, viable choices. And again, the demand was an equality demand for inclusion and an end to differences in treatment for the unmarried as contrasted with the married. So topics like sex and reproduction have traditionally been deemed within the private sphere of life in the American context, but clearly they have significant public implications and call for some sort of legal response. Today, there are controversial issues in the United States in this area, dealing with the status of same-sex relationships and also the nature and extent of reproductive rights, and in particular the use of reproductive technology. All of this is currently in dispute. This area, the sexual revolution area, is also an area in which there have been significant backlashes, and there are ongoing efforts in the United States to push us back into a more puritanical era. And we see that particularly in regard to the religious right. Finally, the third revolution is the NoFault divorce revolution, in which legislatures rejected religious dictates and altered the cultural perceptions that marriage was a lifelong commitment, right? So that this was a significant change. And in fact, in the wake of NoFault divorce revolution, the institution of marriage has been totally reconceived in the United States. So economic and status relationships that were reflected in traditional marriage were significantly restructured. So we talk about marital now rather than personal property, the idea that the marriage produces property, not individuals. So it doesn't belong to the individuals, but to the marital effort. We now speak in terms of parents rather than specifying mothers and fathers. Again, this gender neutrality, this treatment of things as the same. Changes in custody and support rules reflected this aspiration for an egalitarian, gender-neutral family. And the changes in expectations for the family were mirrored in altered expectations outside of the family. So what we now have in the United States is the expectation that both men and women will make relatively equal contributions in terms of care within the family and economic contributions outside of the family, bringing in economic resources to the family. Today, of course, there are many challenges presented in the United States that are related to this change in expectations and relationships within the family. We call them the work-family conflict. A conflict because while the family has supposedly been internally altered, so we have this new model of the egalitarian family that's no longer gender defined, the family as an institution is nonetheless expected to continue to serve its historic role as the entity to which we refer dependency. So that this is what the family has done, the role the family has performed institutionally in the United States, and that continues today. The family is the mechanism whereby dependency is privatized, thus obscuring the need for state responsiveness to individuals in need of care or subsidy. And the laws reflect this allocation of responsibility. It is the family to whom the dependent are referred, not the state or other kinds of societal institutions. Now, all of these mid-20th century revolutions were undertaken in the name of equality. And again, the reforms in all of them demanded the end of exclusion and discrimination or differences in treatment. So we argued for the sameness of treatment. And today in the United States, we have in fact attained equality under those terms. So our laws guarantee equal citizenship, we prohibit discrimination, our equality regime guarantees access and opportunity to all on a par with the historically privileged, white, propertied, free male. Women have the right to be treated the same as men. Our political and civil rights are formally ensured. We can get an education, practice a profession, earn money, own property, vote, serve on a jury, hold office, and so on. All things that were actually denied to women prior to these revolutions. Now, note this conferral of equality on women or others. I mean, we could be talking about racial minorities here, but I'm talking about women. This conferral of equality is an expansion of the ideal of equality that takes nothing away from men, nothing away from the previously privileged group. So it's a win-win situation, at least theoretically. Our vision of equality, however, is not only all-encompassing, it's also, in my opinion, a crude and non-discerning, encompassing all within its embrace. So men can also claim the protection of gender equality should they experience different or unfavorable treatment. And they can do so even if they are privileged as an individual or as a member of an advantaged group. They can do so even against a member of a subordinated group. So again, the equality applies regardless of the position of the person asserting it. The sameness of treatment version of equality ignores history and contexts, as well as differences in circumstances and abilities on the part of those whose treatment is compared. It presumes an equivalence of position and an equivalence of possibilities. Profound inequalities are thus tolerated, even justified, by reference to things like individual responsibility and the workings of an asserted meritocracy within a free market system, so that this is how we structure American society. The state is not mandated to respond to existing inequalities, nor does it have to establish mechanisms to ensure more equitable distribution of either social goods or responsibilities between individuals, groups, and institutions. And in fact, quite the opposite. Positive measures such as affirmative action are suspect in the United States, and generally the state is constrained by law from interference in the status quo, and it's restrained by values such as individual liberty, autonomy, and paramount principles such as freedom of contract, so that they stand in the way. They restrain the state in the United States. Now, of course, American law does recognize that some distortions can exist even in systems that are otherwise based on the market and merit. And the distortions that are recognized in our system are those that can be traced to the historic exclusion of individuals and groups, the situation before the revolutions, right? Characteristics based on things like gender, race, ethnicity, and religion. So we recognize that those exclusions are now deemed impermissible under our equality, sameness of treatment model. But note that it is not discrimination in general that is prohibited in the American system, only discrimination that is based on those designated distinguishing characteristics. So a person can be treated badly so long as they are not treated differently. Anyone can be fired from employment on an employer's whim for any reason whatsoever. Anyone can be denied housing or access to goods and services, so long as the exclusion cannot be traced to discrimination based on some impermissible basis. And again, it's just those categories, those historic categories. To me, one of the most troubling aspects of the American approach to equality is that it takes only a limited view of what should constitute governmental responsibility in regard to social justice issues. In fact, nestled safely within the rhetoric of individual responsibility and this notion of autonomy, current discrimination doctrine enshrines the notion that America provides for real equal access and opportunity. It is assumed that discrimination is discoverable and correctable, an exception to an otherwise just and fair system. This approach to equality is particularly problematic in the United States, where there are growing inequalities in wealth, position, and power, and there are no constitutional guarantees to basic social goods such as housing, education, or health care. Although, as you know, we're in the process of trying to give a little more guarantee to health care, although that probably will be repealed. There is no right to employment and no basic income guarantee in the United States. In fact, we live in a society that is currently proposing further shredding of our rather anemic safety net in order to extend tax cuts for the wealthy. The wealthy, incidentally, are now referred to in our political parlance as job creators, right? All evidence to the contrary. So currently, I'm working on a theory of state responsibility or state responsiveness in hopes that it can be used to modify or to provide a balance against the pervasive individual responsibility restrained state paradigm that is otherwise operating in the United States. And I believe that this is necessary if the United States is ever to begin to address the problems of systematic and persuasive inequality in the distribution of societal wealth and power. My theory begins with the development of the concepts of dependency, vulnerability, and resilience. So those are the three basic concepts I want to talk a little bit about today. Now, one thing to note here, I began as a feminist theorist, but in this articulation of state responsibility, I've moved beyond gender and in fact moved beyond any distinct identity category to the universal. So I refer to this theory as a post-identity theory, which has gotten me into a lot of trouble with lots of people in the United States who don't want to move beyond identities. But anyway, but it includes men as well as women, children and the disabled and the elderly, as well as fully functioning adults. It's a feminism that is inclusive of all human beings and not just focused on the aspect of gender. Now, I recognize that a move to the universal is very problematic in our postmodern world, with its rejection of essentialism and its focus on intersections and constructed identities. So I realize that this is problematic. But I contend that a move to the universal in the way that I'm trying to do with the theory of vulnerability is necessary. In fact, it's compelled by the need to confront dominant legal and political paradigms that are themselves built around universals. And here we could talk about something like the reasonable man, or now, of course, in gender-neutral terms, the reasonable person, or homo economicus, the economic man, a legal actor who engages in rational choice, and these are the concepts that are used constantly, at least in the United States, in talking about legal and policy and political aspects. Most significant in regard to the theory of state responsibility is the universal liberal subject that's embedded in Western political tradition. And so in contrast to this liberal subject, I'm articulating a vulnerable subject, and that's to displace this idea of a liberal subject. The liberal subject exemplifies the position of every man and woman within this political discourse. The liberal subject is surrounded with expectations and aspirations. And these expectations are that the liberal subject is independent, autonomous, self-sufficient, and a functioning adult. Someone who is fully capable of a negotiation, bargaining, and making choices that protect his interests. And consistent with this view of the legal subject, contract is the concept whereby we order and understand social and institutional relationships. So to complement the independent, liberal, autonomous subject, we have this idea of contract, which is the way that he affects his interests. Society is conceptualized in the first instance as built around a social contract, and within society, individual transactions as well as interactions with societal institutions and the state are seen as involving autonomous and independent actors in contract with each other, engaged in the process of negotiation and bargaining. So this becomes the way that we understand both institutional and individual relationships. Individual competence is assumed, and differences in power or circumstances, differences in actual ability are ignored in this way of thinking about things, and in finding jumping to conclusions such as consent to contractual terms. Thus constructed, this universal liberal subject is at the heart of our political and social thought and legal thought. So my questioning of this subject is based on an alternative and somewhat gendered view of reality. The basic question being, if our bodily fragility and our material needs and our dependency on others cannot be ignored in our personal day-to-day lives, how can they be ignored when we theorize our universal legal subject? So if these are realities in our individual lives, how can they be ignored in our theory? In other words, why doesn't the undeniable existence and universality of human dependency present a dilemma for the traditional political and legal theorist? Why isn't that a dilemma? In mainstream theory, dependency is typically dismissed as pathological, as a failure on the part of an individual or a family. And for years, and actually it's more like over a decade at this point, I've argued for a more complex and nuanced understanding of what we mean when we talk about dependency. In its most basic form, I have argued dependency is inevitable and unavoidable. It is universal, it is part of the human condition. It's developmental and biological in nature. All of us were dependent on others for care and provision as infants, and many of us will become dependent as we age or become ill or become disabled. This inevitable form of dependency is the type that is viewed, at least in the United States, and I think probably everywhere, sympathetically, and it sparks charitable impulses as well as being the justification for governmental programs. So in the United States, in political theory, this would be the deserving poor, right? Children, the elderly, the disabled. But there's a second form of dependency that needs to be addressed, and in that context, I look at one form of dependency that relates to but is separate from this inevitable dependency, this biological dependency. And this is the dependency of those who care for the child, care for the elderly, the ill, and the disabled, those who care for inevitable dependence. And I've labeled this form of dependence derivative, right? So it's derivative dependency to reflect the very simple but often overlooked fact that those who care for the children, the elderly, the ill, and the disabled are themselves dependent on resources in order to successfully accomplish that care. This form of dependency is much less obvious, and it tends to be actually invisible, and when it is noticed, it's often stigmatized and condemned. This derivative dependency, this form of dependency, is not inevitable, nor is it universal. So that distinguishes it from the inevitable dependency, which is both. Only some of us become caretakers in society. Derivative dependency is socially imposed, so it's not part of our human condition, but rather socially imposed through our construction of institutions such as the family, with roles and relationships that are traditionally defined and differentiated along gendered lines, so that you can see that the family as an institution grows up around both inevitable dependency in the first instance and derivative dependency in the second. Hence, we find historic differences in expectations and aspirations attached to roles within the family, husband versus wife, father versus mother, and son versus daughter, and so on. But remember, feminists and other reformers altered the language of family law and the expectations for family law, making it gender neutral in hopes that that would help to achieve a more egalitarian sharing of domestic responsibilities and allow a sharing of market participation also. But that has not transpired, and it's in fact not worked in the United States. That kind of egalitarianism has, while it's true in form, is not true in practice. There's another type of sharing that has to be put in place before gender equality is in fact realizable, I argue. Specifically, there must be a more equitable distribution of the burdens of inevitable dependency across societal institutions. So the traditional relegation of dependency to the family has to be disrupted, and that's what a lot of my work has argued for. We need to place some obligation on the market and on the state to relieve and to support and to accommodate institutional changes to accommodate the family. We need a restructuring not only of our aspirations for the family, but our expectations for these other institutions. So instead of theorizing separate spheres, as is traditionally done in political theory, the private and public sphere as separate, I talk about these as symbiotic institutions. You can't have change in one without corresponding complementary changes in the other. And this kind of reallocation of responsibility for dependency seemed to me particularly appropriate since both state and market institutions reap the benefits of care work, the reproduction and regeneration of society. So that's what produces the taxpayer, the worker, the citizen, the soldier, the students, the teachers, whatever the social role is. Now, some commentators recognized the strength of these arguments that I made about dependency, and this is all in a book called The Autonomy Myth, A Theory of Dependency, which is about, at this point, 11 years old. No, it's not that old, 6, 7 years old. And so they recognized that it was a significant critique. But because what I labeled inevitable dependency is episodic and shifting in degree over the lifetime of an individual, so we're not, at least most of us, constantly dependent, mainstream political and social theorists could conveniently ignore the critique that I was making in spinning out their theories about what constituted justice, efficiency, or liberty. This form of dependency, the inevitable biological dependency, if it was acknowledged at all, is viewed merely as a stage that the liberal subject has long ago transcended or left behind, and therefore is of no pressing theoretical interest as these grand theoretical schemes get played out. As for derivative dependency, the dependency of the caretaker, that could be conveniently dismissed by reference to these liberal constructs such as individual choice and the norm of personal responsibility. Those who take up the caretaking role have chosen to do so, after all, and they should not now complain about their situation and expect others to subsidize their choices, right? So if you want to have children, then you should be able to care for those children yourself and not come to the state or anybody else for assistance. Thus, largely rendered invisible within the private family, both forms of dependency have been comfortably privatized and mistakenly assumed to be adequately managed for the vast majority of people. And again, here I'm talking about the United States in this regard, so things might be very, very different. I hope they're different in your countries. Which brings me to the current work. Now, I kind of been working on this for decades, and I wasn't willing to give up on the insights, which I think are valid, that I had struggled with in theorizing dependency. So the fact that it was still possible to ignore what I was doing, I said, well, you know, I have to think harder. So I turned to the concept of vulnerability to confront this myth of autonomy and to argue for a more responsive state for accommodation and support for individuals. So like dependency, vulnerability is universal. So now I'm going to talk about how I theorize vulnerability. It is universal. And this basic premise of universal vulnerability forms the foundation for my assertion that vulnerability must be at the heart of our ideas about social and state responsibility. But there are additional qualities to vulnerability that I think make it more expansive and a more powerful concept than dependency to use when we're talking about state responsibility. Our vulnerability is constant across our lifespan, so it is not episodic like dependency. Human vulnerability arises from our embodiment, which carries with it the imminent or ever-present possibility of harm, injury, or misfortune. Note that harm can take a variety of forms. Harm can range from harm that is mild, things that are mildly annoying, to those that are catastrophically devastating and permanent in nature. So harm is an expansive concept. Bodily harm can result from a variety of causes. It can occur accidentally or be the result of intentional actions of others. Bodily harm can result from the unleashing of forces in nature, from the mere passage of time, or from the fact that we as human beings exist in a world full of unpredictable material realities that act upon our bodies. We may suffer or succumb to diseases that are random or the result of pandemics or biologically based catastrophes. In addition to viruses and bacteria, our bodies are also vulnerable to environmental forces, weather systems that produce floods or droughts, accompanying famines or fires, natural disasters that are certainly beyond our individual control to prevent. It's also important to realize that vulnerability is complex and can manifest itself in non-bodily forms. So I'm thinking about vulnerability not only in terms of embodiment, but our bodily vulnerability is compounded by the possibility that should we become ill or injured, there may be other disruptions or accompanying disruptions of existing employment, economic, or family relationships. So there are relational harms not located in the body itself, but in the interruption or destruction of institutional or social relationships that make us vulnerable, this possibility. But this form of harm, this relational harm, can be as catastrophic to an individual as the bodily variety, and illustrates to me how all of us as human beings are dependent on social relationships and institutional and societal institutions. Now, an important part of the vulnerability approach is that while we can attempt to lessen risk or act to mitigate possible manifestations of our vulnerability, the possibility of harm can never be eliminated, or it cannot be eliminated. Certainly, we have to admit that many harms are beyond individual or even human control. The process of aging and death, for example, are clear internal biological processes that show the limitations of human ability to avoid the ultimate consequences of our embodiment, right? I mean, we cannot avoid that. However, importantly, society and its institutions can and do address potential harms through law and policy. So even though we can't totally avoid it, we do address it. Which brings me to a final and somewhat paradoxical point about vulnerability. While human vulnerability is universal, constant, and complex, it is also particular. All human beings stand in a position of constant vulnerability, but in regard to the individual experience of vulnerability, we are positioned differently. And I actually think that this is again, a strength of the approach, that it recognizes both the universality, which is the claim for social responsibility, but also the individuality in terms of experience. And there are two forms of difference that are relevant to the vulnerability theory in this regard. First, we have different forms of embodiment. So it's based on the notion of our embodiment, but our embodiment differs, right? Physical, mental, and intellectual differences do matter. So there's an individual component to the vulnerability analysis that looks at those kinds of differences. And certainly here, if we were talking about those sorts of differences, the anti-discrimination norm would be relevant here. So we wouldn't want discrimination based on a difference such as race or whatever. So that would certainly apply. But there's a second type of difference, and this is the one that I'm more interested in, that we as individuals are also differently situated within webs of economic and institutional relationships, so that this is the institutional component of the vulnerability analysis. And this is the area where I think law and policy can and should respond. So that this is where the social response comes into this web of economic and institutional relationships. Vulnerability, therefore, is theorized as both universal and particular, with an individual and an institutional dimension, and these are, of course, interacting. The important insight from this dual nature of vulnerability, it seems to me, is that our individual experience varies according to the quality and quantity of resources that we can possess or command, right? So that's what affects our experience of vulnerability. So while society through law and policy cannot eradicate our vulnerability, it can and does mediate, compensate, and lessen vulnerability through programs, institutions, and structures. Now, important in talking about this, the counterpoint to vulnerability is not invulnerability. Right? And every time I hear this, I get angry. For that's impossible to achieve. Invulnerability is impossible to achieve. But rather resilience, the resilience that comes from having some means with which to address and confront the circumstances of our lives. So this is where the idea or concept of resilience comes in. For me, the strength of a vulnerability analysis focuses attention on the institutions that give us resilience, that give us these resources that comprise resilience in relation to the human vulnerability. So that the focus, the strength of the analysis is on this institutional dimension rather than individual differences. The connection between resilience and resources that are supplied by societal institutions allows me to make the corresponding connection between those institutions and state responsibility. So that this is where the institutional analysis comes into play. Societal institutions collectively form systems that play an important role in this lessening, ameliorating, and compensating for vulnerability. So that's where we start off with the institutions. Together and independently, institutions provide us with resources in the form of advantages or coping mechanisms that cushion us when we face misfortune, disaster, violence, whatever, the circumstances of life. And I've now gotten up to 5 different types of resources or assets that these institutions can provide. I started off, I think, initially with 3, but now I'm up to 5, so it might increase. Physical, human, social, ecological, or environmental, and existential. So physical resources are the physical goods or material things that determine our present quality of life, things like housing, food, entertainment, means of transportation, so forth. And law affects these institutions. Tax and inheritance law are part of the system, but so are banking rules and regulations part of the system that affect these physical resources. Human resources also affect our material well-being, and these are the goods that contribute to the development of a human being, to us as human beings, allowing us to participate in other institutions, the market and so on, making it possible to accumulate material resources that, again, give us resilience in the face of our vulnerability. And Sen and Nussbaum talk about this in terms of human capital or capabilities, systems that provide education, training, knowledge, and experience, and the regulation of those. In addition to physical and human resources, though, I think also important are social assets or resources. And these are provided by less tangible, not so easily quantifiable types of relationships, including social networks from which we gain support and strength. Now, of course, the family is a major institution providing societal resources, although, and here in American audiences, somebody says, oh, but my family is miserable. They are a drain on my resources. They don't provide me with resources. But theorizing family as providing resources independent of individual family circumstances, I think we can do. Other associations, political parties, labor, trade unions, these are collections in which individuals bolster their resilience by joining together and addressing their shared vulnerabilities to things like the market, for example. In addition, we have ecological resources that are conferred through our position in relation to the physical or natural environments in which we find ourselves, so that we do gain resilience from our location within this physical environment. And finally, existential resources are provided by systems of belief or aesthetics, religion, culture, or art, and perhaps even we could put politics there. And these systems can help us to understand our place within the world and allow us to see meaning and beauty in our existence, which again gives us some resilience in the face of our vulnerabilities. So the vulnerability approach draws the link between these various types of resources that come from our institutions and state responsibility, because the state touches all of these institutions. In fact, the institutions providing resources to individuals can only be brought into legal existence through state mechanisms. Entities such as corporations, schools, workplaces, families, or churches are legitimated and given a status that confers both benefits and protections by and through law. Their very content and meaning is defined through state processes. Further, the dissolution of many of these entities is also accomplished only through state processes. So what I argue is the state involvement in the creation and maintenance of these institutions mandates that the state be vigilant in ensuring that the distribution of assets accomplished through these institutions is done with attention to public values, including equality and justice, objectives that are beyond private or profit motivations that actually now govern the operation of these institutions in American society. But instead of this, what we see in the U.S. is that asset conferring, within these systems of asset conferring, individuals are positioned differently. Some are privileged and some are disadvantaged. And here, the recent economic crisis, I think, shows the inequities of privilege. Some individuals and most banking and financial institutions get bonuses and bailouts and are reaping now huge profits. Again, we all share the economic vulnerability, but some have been assisted by the state, while individual homeowners or laid off workers have been abandoned by the state and left to bear the economic losses without any kind of subsidy or support. The responsibility to overcome existing systemic inequalities has been viewed as an individual, not a state responsibility for some, but only for some within American society. So exposing this inequality of privilege and challenging it is what I think a vulnerability approach seeks to accomplish. Now, a few final points in conclusion, and this is more for an American audience perhaps, but what I would say to an American audience is that our choice is not one between an active state on the one hand and an inactive or restrained state on the other, although this is what our politicians present, right, as a big government, small government, active state, restrained state, so forth. The present insistence by some that the state need be constrained underestimates or even ignores the many ways in which the state, through law, shapes institutions from their inception to their dissolution, and the way in which those institutions produce and replicate existing inequalities. Rather, it seems to me, the choice is whether or not the state is going to fulfill a responsibility to ensure equality of access and opportunity. And in order to do that, we need an active, not a restrained state. To do this would require the adoption of a realistic conception of the human subject, not an abstract, autonomous, liberal myth, but a vulnerable subject. And to that end, it's imperative that we change the discourse to recognize that none of us is independent and self-sufficient individual. We all benefit from society and its institutions, but within this set of relationships, some are advantaged and privileged, while others are disadvantaged. So a commitment to equality now, for me, means that the state be constituted for the general or common benefit and not for the advantage of a select few, be those select few, be they individuals or institutions, but they shouldn't be privileged. The state has a responsibility to structure conditions where all of us can aspire to realize our abilities as fully as possible. Finally, in conclusion, it's important to conclude with the observation that a vulnerability approach does not mean that different treatment or results, the conferral of privilege or advantage, is never warranted. So it doesn't mean that at all. It does mean that if the state confers or tolerates institutional conferral of privilege or advantage, that there is some affirmative obligation on the state and its institutions to offer an explanation why disparate circumstances are allowed to continue. Why is privilege warranted? What justifies privilege? In other words, privileging can happen, but it should be transparent and justified, not invisible as it is today when we think of equality in the United States only in terms of anti-discrimination and sameness of treatment, and ignore all the existing structural inequalities that are built into and invisible within that system. So that's it. That was slow enough.
Thank you so much, Martha, for this fascinating presentation about 30 years of thinking. Yeah. And also you ended with to an American audience. I am sure that these are highly relevant for the countries or the country that we are in now, although in many a little different way.
Well, one of the things that I have noticed over the past couple of years when I've been traveling in Europe and talking about vulnerability analysis, and actually is how it does resonate in other legal cultures and other political cultures. And it made me aware that one of the things that Americans have been very good at, not me, but others, is exporting our particular way of looking at the autonomous, individual, liberal subject. I mean, we've been, and the economic, the triumph of economics as a kind of model over the way we organize society has been very transportable to other cultures.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
Sadly.
Yeah. Ulrika, do you have anything?
Comment?
Mm-hmm.
No, not really. I think I can start, or if anyone else would like to come in. I was thinking about this. You said vulnerability comes from dependency, and we're all positioned differently. And then, if I got it right, this position comes from embodiment, and also institutional relationships. And then you said that's where law comes in.
Right.
Yeah. So law only comes in this level, at this level?
At the institutional?
Yeah.
No, it comes in on the individual level too,
Yeah.
so that you would have certainly law prohibiting discrimination based on individual characteristics, or you could have law addressing things like disability, so you could have law that would address individual differences also. But and that's certainly important. But for me, the thing that I'm most interested in is pulling it away from a focus on individuals. I mean, the problem with a discrimination model, and which is of course the way we think even about disability in the United States, is that it depends on the individual actions, individual characteristics on the one hand, and individual actions on the other. So the intent or the actions to discriminate, to exclude. And if that's not there, then there's no remedy, which is why I want to pull it back or focus more on the second kind of difference, which is how we're positioned within institutional and other kinds of relationships. So my colleague Ani Satz, who, if you're interested in disability, she takes the vulnerability analysis and argues with American disability law, it says that, within the workplace, you have to accommodate a worker. So if they need, if they need Braille so that they can, then that's fine. But it fragments their lives. It doesn't consider the needs that they have to get to work or the needs that they might have at home to enable them to work. So it fragments the human experience, focusing on individual employer responsibility, again, not the entire context of a human life.
Thank you so much for your presentation. It was really, really interesting to hear. It was beautiful how you sort of brought out the materiality of the subject. My question has to do with, as I understand it, you talk about this liberal subject, which is very, very hard to find when you look at the materiality of life. It simply doesn't exist. And in that sense, it's really easy to accept your theory, since we are, at all stages in life, vulnerable, and as material, physical human beings, it's really hard to refute that part of what you are saying, in a sense. So my question is, are those two ways of looking at the subject, are these two really comparable? Or, and here's my question, can you see in the way that you've been theorizing vulnerability, the subject such as, for example, Emmanuel Levinas theorized it as rather, or psychoanalysis in a sense, analyzed the subject in contrast to the liberal subject, the autonomous subject, but rather as the interdependent subject. Do you see a connection in your own theorizing between Levinas, for example?
Yeah, I do think, what I describe is interdependency, and it's based on that. Although, again, I'm more interested in the institutional context rather than the individual psychoanalytic perspective, because I'm interested in changing things and not changing people necessarily. Although one of the things that you did raise, or your question raised for me, and I want to be sure to mention this, is that I don't reject autonomy as as a value or as a goal. I think it's really important to realize that autonomy is a significant, and whether we talk about it in terms of human dignity or however we talk about it on an individual level. So I don't want to reject that. But I do think that that autonomy is only one value, and that what the problem is in the United States is that it now is the lens through which we look at every other value. So it distorts our way we think about equality. Everything is through this lens of liberty or autonomy. So what I want to do is to kind of put autonomy in its place, in essentially saying that it's unrealizable for many people without the prior commitment to equality and the institutional arrangements that guarantee some form of equality. So that's not directly your point, but your question did raise that in my mind. So.
Thank you for the wonderful presentation. Well, I would like to go back to the history of the 1960s and 70s, as you told it, because while you were describing your three revolutions, I was thinking that from a Nordic perspective, the story would be quite different. And of course, we had sexual revolution, and we had NoFault divorce and equal rights in the family. But instead of anti-discrimination movement, I think that the big story for those decades and for the emancipation was the right to work, especially for women. Right to work, right to childcare, right to social security, right to housing, all these social rights that we got not only during the 60s but during a long course of history. And I think I have to congratulate you that you have come to the right country. Because I think you have a lot to learn here. And behind all this equality project, I think there is the concept, or some kind of concept of vulnerability and dependency. That's how this country was built. Anti-discrimination, that has come much later, especially in my country, Finland, which comes often a little behind Sweden. We have started to talk about anti-discrimination only after we accessed the European Union in 1995. And I think that anti-discrimination processes, they are also very important. So if you are saying that, you are sad about the United States having exported the concept of subject and the libertarian subject to Europe, I think that's not one of the worst things that the United States has exported around the world.
Oh, but you'll have to tell me what the others are.
Well, think about weapons.
Oh, yeah. I was thinking ideology, but...
Yeah. But actually, who has the fatherhood? I mean, in the French Revolution, there was liberty, equality, and brotherhood, whatever that means. Maybe we have also exported something, and now it's bouncing back. Maybe, I don't know. I don't have a question.
Well, but you say, I mean, because it's interesting, one of the things that we were talking about, and one of the things that we might actually be exploring in future comparative research is just this notion that in Sweden, for example, there are all of these rights to work and social security and social rights that are provided, and rules against pregnancy, discrimination based on pregnancy, and all these supports and childcare, and yet there's still inequality when it comes to employment and the choices that young women make when they're thinking about becoming mothers, becoming parents. So you have Sweden on the one hand with all of those social supports, and the United States on the other without them. But yet the young women somehow or another are in similar positions, and it's interesting to me why that's the case. And I don't have an answer for that, because we just actually were discovering that this was in fact true to some extent, and we're not even sure to what extent, but that is something that we want to be looking at. So I think that the social supports are wonderful and absolutely necessary, but even beyond that, there's something that I think is kind of going on. I would say anti-discrimination, an anti-discrimination approach really depends on drawing differences between people, on an us and a them, and a comparative perspective. And what we've seen in the United States is what I think anti-discrimination law can take you so far, and you certainly need it for things like one person, one vote, or equal pay for equal work. You know, that conception of equality is important there. That when it gets mired in identity politics and you get conflicting interest groups, and how you choose and make choices and balance between them, it really is very disruptive of any kind of movement forward politically in progressive ways. And in fact, what happens is that those identity groups are pitted against each other in political processes that end up with everybody getting a lot less. That's what I see there.
Yes, I think that one important human resource is what might be called having a positive relation to self, a positive image of self, by which I mean having a basic self-confidence, self-respect, and so on. Now, the second step, such a positive relationship could probably only be developed with the help of other people, by receiving different forms of recognition from other people. And the opposite of that would, of course, be to be met with disrespect from other people, and with probably more or less devastating effects on your relation to self. And in fact, I think this kind of harms comes rather close to what you mentioned as relational harms. I mentioned this because in social philosophy and partly in social sciences in Europe and elsewhere, there is a rather big discussion today centering on the concept of recognition and disrespect. And in fact, I think that approach has strong similarities with your approach. And for example, this series of recognition share with your approach a rather strong critique of the idea of a liberal subject. So I think here is a kind of theory that in some sense can be added on to your approach and project.
Tell me a little bit about the concept of disrespect. What all is encompassed in disrespect? Is it an active concept, or is neglect? Does that count as disrespect? What counts as disrespect? I guess you say recognition from others on the one hand, right?
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Well, of course, various forms on the interpersonal level, the word that hurts or an action that hurts someone, but this can also come in institutional form, in the form of a law that disrespects certain groups, excludes certain groups, and so on. So in that sense, it's a broad concept with different levels, both on interpersonal and more institutionalized.
We had been talking earlier, and the reason I ask you that is because the concept was raised in earlier discussions, and I was thinking about this. And my daughter teaches in a New York City public school, right? And the students there are using books that are 20 years old. Now, would disrespect cover that situation? Because certainly there's no affirmative action that says to those students that you're worthless, right? But nonetheless, what's the message that's received by someone who is in a classroom and they're given a 20-year-old textbook? So, I mean, I guess that was what I was asking you. Is disrespect, is it a nuanced enough concept, or how complex is it when you understand it that way?
I could imagine this could cover the example you give. That handing out such old textbooks would be a way of saying you're not worthy of any more recent, up-to-date material.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Thank you for coming here and listening to us. My question is from a Nordic or a Swedish context, and I think we have a long history of the welfare state and recognition of vulnerability here. And I would say that perhaps we hear what you say in a different way than people in America, or probably we do because of that.
Right.
And I think that even those of us who embrace the welfare state fully would say that it seems to come, the need to provide resources for people seems to come with an unavoidable flip side, with strong normative, from a mild patriarchal attitude towards people to a very strong sanctions towards those who are poor but not deserving. And to us, concepts like autonomy or integrity or privacy can actually provide can provide us with a help from that attitude. So I even though I embrace the concept of vulnerability, I also feel a bit reluctant to accept it because of the flip side it might come with.
Right. Well, again, as I mentioned earlier, it's not to say that autonomy is not important, but it starts from a level, and again, this is thinking about states that are much less responsive than your state. So you've already achieved that level of responsiveness. So then you can worry about the autonomy and the independence and so forth. But for states that don't have those kinds of social welfare, I think it's really, when you talk about autonomy, you say it's individual responsibility when you start off with people who are so disadvantaged within the context of their institutional settings that there's no way for them to act, there are no options for them to exercise autonomy in regard to.
But I still believe it's hard to strike a balance between those different sides.
Yes.
Okay. I also want to thank you for coming here and making this presentation. So within my research subject, which is on the compulsory psychiatric care and how it complies with the new UN Convention of Rights of Persons with Disabilities, I also struggle with the subject of the liberal subject, because as you know, coercion is okay within the psychiatric framework, but not within the somatic care. And so far I've been trying to go at it from an equality perspective, but it always comes into the difficult question of arguing that persons with certain mental illnesses are just as capable as others, or just as incapable as others of making rational or acceptable decisions. So my first question is, what would I gain from using your vulnerability dependence approach instead of the equality one? And the second is a bit related to what I heard before, because I'm in one way a bit hesitant to go into the vulnerability dependence discourse when it comes to this group that has been described that way for so long and is now, going into the autonomous, independence, integrity.
A couple of things. One is one of the, and I didn't mention it just because there's a limited time and it's a big theory, but the designation of only some groups as vulnerable, right? I mean, because that's a way to stigmatize and to say, in fact, imply that the rest of us are not. I think that has to be confronted. In the book that I'm working on, I use 3 examples that occurred in the first decade of the 20th century that, again, have altered the way that Americans think about ourselves in regard to our vulnerability. One, of course, is 9/11. The second is Katrina. And the third is this recent economic catastrophe. And they all illustrate different components of the vulnerability theory, including the fact that all of us are vulnerable, and the fact that there is no way for us to individually protect ourselves against certain manifestations of vulnerability because it's so dependent on what others do. One of the other things that comes from that is that unless, and I believe this strongly, unless we do understand human vulnerability and understand what that means in terms of institutional and other arrangements, that when we're confronted with our vulnerability, it can be, the fear that arises can be manipulated and used in very regressive ways. And that's, of course, what happened with 9/11, and it can happen all the time. My postdoc is actually looking at this manipulation and of vulnerability to achieve questionable political ends. So while I understand the concern that can arise, it seems to me that the denial of our universal vulnerability is very dangerous and can be used in ways that are really quite bad. As far as the mental illness, There's another, a lot of people at Emory now are working with the vulnerability concept. It's been, fortunately, excitingly, designated the interdisciplinary theme for our graduate school. And so there is a young man in the English department who is working with disability. He's working with psychiatric and other disabilities, named Ben Reiss, R-E-I-S-S. And he looked at, so he applied the vulnerability analysis to look at institutional arrangements and institutional responses to West Virginia Tech shooting. And you might look at that because it's really kind of interesting. And what it does, I mean, one way to think about the vulnerability analysis is that it's a heuristic that shifts the way that we consider situations and things to ask a different set of questions. So rather than looking at how can we identify these potential mass murderers in our institutions, right? We look at, and this is what Ben does, how can institutions respond or structure themselves in such a way that people don't fall through the cracks. I mean, it's just a different way of looking at things. So you might, I don't know how to answer your question because I don't know enough about what you're doing, but you might look at Ben's piece and you can get it in the vulnerability website has under resources, publications, and so there's, I think his is included. You can just click on it and it'll come up.
Yeah. Thanks for your presentation. Really interesting. I have many questions. I'll limit myself to one. Just in continuation of this universal vulnerability and coming here to the Nordic countries, it can't escape my mind just a rhetorical question. Well, isn't it possible that we have been able to establish such a universal Scandinavian vulnerability because we have such a monolithic, or have had such a monolithic culture? In other words, what are some of the preconditions for having a universal precondition of vulnerability? And could we ever imagine such a thing in the US or indeed in wider scopes, European goals? So, just a comment. My real question is, and I would like to elaborate on that, how do you get rid of this thinking in categories? The differential treatment. Because even if you go on to saying, okay, we are all vulnerable, nevertheless we're still vulnerable in different respects, and we're vulnerable in different degrees, and of course in any state structure, in any country with limited resources, that will always spark the question where to use which resources. And I have yet to know of any country that does not think in categories. So my question really is, how do you escape the categorical thinking or the differential thinking?
Well, I mean, we need categories. I think, especially in law, it seems to me that law can't operate without categories. I guess that what I would say about the categories is I would rather focus on categories of institutional arrangements rather than categories of individual characteristics. And that I think is really important and necessary to do. In regard to your observations about vulnerability, the whole theory is premised on the fact that vulnerability is in fact universal. It's not a question that the state makes it universal, but that it is. And then one of the ways to think about society is that it's, or at least you could think about society as organized around our vulnerabilities. I mean, we create institutions because we need them, whether that institution is the family or that institution is the prison system, I mean, whatever it is, but it's perceived kind of social need. So the vulnerability is there. So whether the culture is monolithic or not is really irrelevant, right? What is monolithic is human being, the human condition, and it's true that there are differences within that. And there are the kind of individual differences, embodiment differences that we can talk about in terms of categories. But again, the part of the vulnerability analysis that I'm interested in is that second group of differences, which is the institutional and other relationships, because that's something that, in fact, society can act to monitor, to see if the conditions are such that they're more egalitarian, that there is more equality of access and opportunity. The way that at least the culture in the United States now operates is that we don't do periodic re-examination of our institutions, and we don't think about what are the implications of, think broadly about what are the implications of various reforms. So last year I spent a lot of time in Ireland, and one of the things that did a lot of work on vulnerability there, one of the things that Northern Ireland has, and actually Scotland has this also, is a Commission for Children and Youth, whose sole task, this is an institution that's funded by the government. Its task is to consult widely with NGOs and university researchers and so forth and so on, so that legislation that's proposed, they do an impact statement. What would the impact be on children and youth? Now that, when I look at that through a vulnerability analysis, I say that's the kind of institutional arrangement you should have, so that the impact on children and youth then becomes part of the policy discussion about whether this legislation is a good idea or not, right? Now, I don't know if you do that in Sweden, or wherever. But it just seemed to me that was the kind of thing that, again, manifests a responsive state in the way that I mean it, talking about in terms of vulnerability. So it's that institutional arrangement, again, the responsibility of the state to really structure a regime of true equality of access. Now, will everybody end up equal? No, of course not. Because you do have autonomy, or you want autonomy, you want individual responsibility. It's not to disregard those, but to put them in perspective in the context of of a commitment to true equality of access and opportunity.
Johanna?
Well, I was thinking that maybe that's the strength of the vulnerability concept, that if you think about the American liberal subject, or you think about the Nordic welfare state project, they both have a very universal concept of the subject. Even it's different, but it's a very universal concept. And maybe the strength of the vulnerability concept is exactly that with the help of that, you can direct attention to different situations. And I think the gender aspect that you took up is very interesting in this regard, because very often we try to approach gender as fundamental categories in a very universal way, but that's not the way people interact in empirical reality.
Right.
Gender plays in very different ways in different situations. So maybe that's, with vulnerability concept, maybe you can approach these situations. Right.
Yeah, in terms of intersectionality, which I understand is becoming very much a part of the European discussion right now too. See, for me, and as intersectionality gets played out in the American context, we talk about intersecting identities, right? So we talk about race and gender and religion and whatever, and it's all this kind of intersecting identities. But I view what intersects are these systems of privilege and disadvantage. So it helps to explain why a Hillary Clinton, so you have, gender, right, but she still manages to succeed in some ways, or Barack Obama, where you have race and you have, because what happens with identity, and speaking of essentializing, it seems to me that that's the most essential way of thinking about people anyway, is that a characteristic then defines them. And certainly there are enough exceptions to saying, well, okay, you've had 25 years of, of affirmative action based on race. So isn't it time now that you're equal? You got your chance. I mean, and this is what happens. This is what even the Supreme Court is saying in terms of affirmative action based on race. Certainly women in the United States, at least, were never given the benefits of any true affirmative action. It was always the notion, well, you're being treated equal. You have equality. Why is that a problem? And again, it's because it's based on I am being discriminated against because I am a woman or because I am a person of color, where that's no longer the problem, at least in the United States. Not that discrimination never occurs, but the social inequalities are not based on that form of discrimination. They're based on different kinds of institutional arrangements.
I was thinking about the example you had on youth and so on, discussing how to include them. And I would like to draw your attention to the mainstreaming approach in the EU project as a strategy. It started out in '96 as regards gender, but is now more completely covered in the Lisbon Treaty, also with regard to other groups of that are protected through discrimination legislation, but also to some extent, I would say, within general inclusion categories in this that are called the European social market state. So this can, of course, be done with greater or less success, and there is always things to criticize, but at least it's a general strategy, you can say, within the European setting. And to that.
Can I ask you a question about that? I'm familiar with the mainstreaming, but who gets left out? I mean, so when you're talking about identities, right? Gender, race, disability, who's left out, right? And what's the justification for that? And is that really? I mean, it may be that it's inclusive, but it's like I wrote a book. Called The Neutered Mother, The Sexual Family, and it was about marriage in the United States. And you start to look at the institution of marriage, and everybody's arguing, well, we should same-sex marriage, and we should include this, and we should include that. And my question was, why are we focusing on putting more and more into that category? Why don't we just explode the category and talk about, what it is that's being done here? Why use those categories? What happens in the United States, and I don't know if this is true here, but is that these categories serve as proxies for other kinds of social problems that they do not, in fact, get to. So if the problem is exclusion, if the problem is poverty, if the problem is, that's not gotten to by saying, well, let's deal with race in the United States. Now, race and poverty, there's a relationship between them, but poverty extends well beyond race. So it's those categories and the fact that we're leaving some people out and some arrangements out that actually should be brought in. So maybe you can answer that question for me.
Who are left out? I don't think that it is possible to give a general answer to that. I think you will have to make an analysis in context and also in the historical context, and of course, and with no doubt poverty is related to many of the non-equal treatment grounds protected so far, and also with and it's at the heart of the market, and that's what makes it so impossible to deal with in a direct way. So I think the mainstreaming approach, and it started out with gender, and see where this has gotten us, not to solve the problem really, but of course we're probably better off with that strategy than without it. That does not mean that it really solves all the problems and so on. So it's an eternal project, and you will always have to analyze it in context. That's at least what I think.
I understand now, once I was getting depressed about how slow progress is, at least in the United States, social change, and she said to me, "Oh, Martha, you have to remember we're in the middle of a revolution that started with the Enlightenment." I don't know that it made me feel all that better, but it took the pressure off.
But nevertheless, with an active mainstreaming approach and where it's really applied, and it should be in governmental proposals for new legislation and new institutional arrangements, as you are arguing. Well, the good thing with that is that you precisely have this public argumentation on how to justify certain solutions, and with regard to certain vulnerable groups that have been identified. There are most certainly also other groups that are not that identified, and not always they do this, they apply this mainstreaming approach in a very thorough way and so on, but well, something is better than nothing in that sense, and it makes arguments more transparent. Yeah.
Again, my question is, who is left out, and can their exclusion be justified? What does a category like gender get us that that justifies exclusion? I mean, does it justify it? Is it a category that can actually be used to get the things that we actually want? Not that it's not better for some people, because I think that's obviously true, but is it sufficient? And so I would want to know, who's, and also what happens then if the inclusion is not only gender, but it becomes ethnicity and religion and disability, and so you have all of these things that are coming in. How does that get balanced out when there's conflict between between groups, for example? And so those are all questions that come because of the experience in the United States with actually what's happened there. And there's a distinction, I think, between looking at the example I used in terms of Northern Ireland, looking at childhood as a socially constructed status, childhood as an institution, and how that might be treated, versus looking at something like gender. So that it seems to me, well, anyway, there's a difference between those. It's one is an institutional arrangement, and the other one is perhaps a category that is good for some purposes, but not for others.
Yeah, I just have a small comment on your saying that whom are excluded and whom will we need to include. And I think that in discrimination law, we constantly work on how to include more and more. And in my current work, for example, I'm very interested in young people or children from a discrimination perspective. They are discriminated against on grounds of their young age, for instance. And that is a new discrimination field. And I think we could cover more and more, perhaps discrimination on grounds of limited financial means or poverty is a way of addressing these people also from a discrimination perspective. I also want to add to Anne, who mentioned the mainstreaming strategy, another discrimination, another concept of discrimination, which I find very a positive way of framing more and more or developing more and more this discrimination area, and that is the elimination of stereotyping. We know the stereotyping concept from the Women's Convention, and which has really been addressed now also from an EU perspective, how we are stereotyping in all our institutions, in the media, in the family, in the education establishment, and that is addressed nowadays as a discrimination problem. So I think that is very important.
So who's doing the discrimination? With the discrimination, you have to identify something that is discriminating?
For instance, in schools, we know school books or curriculum, it is very often very stereotyped, or it presents gender, the male and female, in very gendered ways or stereotyped ways, and that could be addressed as a discrimination problem.
No, I just was wondering, but you need, with the discrimination model, something or some entity, someone that is actually
the school is discriminating. Yeah.
So, and then in this, do you have a distinction between like public and private actors in regard?
No, because the discrimination, it covers both the public and the private agents.
So
it's both, yeah.
So a financial institution, for example, or any private entity like a corporation,
Yeah.
one of these global corporations,
Yeah.
you could say they're discriminating.
Yeah.
Okay, so there's no distinction between state and non-state
No,
actors.
no. It is a concept which covers all agents or entities. Yeah.
Yes, I mean, in this, when we discuss discrimination, it's really a problem with discrimination that we, I mean, move this kind of, we point at certain groups and say that this is our discrimination groups and grounds, but then when they collide and when there are different interests in, it's not the political and it's not the democratical system that decides, but it's the legal system. And I think that is a big problem with discrimination rights, that you move something away from democracy and from, doing this kind of looking at the interests and putting them together, and instead you make it a legal process.
Right. But I'm also thinking about the distinction between the idea of discrimination against and privileging, which is part of the vulnerability analysis, and it's a very different sort of way of looking at things, because discrimination, at least in my mind, and I have to think about all of this and talk to people and figure out, but discrimination against as a legal matter is the context of proof. How it is that you demonstrate that, where how that gets translated into a legal system. It's different than a different kind of question than looking at privilege, which and it seems to me, I've argued this before, that at least in the United States, when people who are interested in alleviating poverty and kind of progressive politics, we spend a lot of time talking about the disadvantaged and their characteristics and their situation, and not enough time looking at privilege. And who it is that actually is reaping all of the benefits. But the records are all there. I mean, the work is there in the corporate boardrooms, in the way that society is organized in our institutions, who it is that actually gets privilege. But as a legal matter, it's a discrimination. It's extremely difficult to get an actual discrimination case through a U.S. court. And a discrimination model also is based on the individual pursuing a remedy rather than society, which is another disadvantage of it. Puts the burden back on the discriminated against individual. So anyway, just think about that.
Because you mentioned something that I'm not sure that you mean, or perhaps you want to expand on that, that you want to change things. And that's very clear. You want to have, you want to change the institutions and you want to make them better. And I fully sympathize with that. And you said, I want to change things, I don't want to change individuals. Where I come from, sort of, is that it's hard to separate. How do you make, or my question then perhaps is, how do you separate between things and individuals? And how are institutions supposed to change unless there's an individual realization and an ethical move? And that sort of returns to my question, how then do we perceive a vulnerability not as a measurable and fixable, better or worse categories, general or less general, intersecting or not, instead of an vulnerability which is built into the very human condition that is constant and unfixable, but which we all have to live with and deal with. So that would be.
But that's exactly what you just said, is how the vulnerability, that is the vulnerability thesis, that it is constant and we all have to deal with it. The reason that I don't want to focus on people and changing people is, again, it's related to to exactly the situation with poverty. So what do we do to address poverty? Well, we change the attitude of people. So we don't give them incentives, such as providing social welfare, because we want to give them motivation. So again, it brings the analysis down to the individual and makes the problem the result of individual failings rather than institutional arrangements. Now, if you work on institutions, of course it affects individuals. I mean, that's the whole point of doing it, right? But it doesn't say that the way to get institutional reform is through actually changing the way individuals, poor people, poor mothers, poor children respond. So it just, again, it's a question of emphasis. And what I hope is that if we could actually fashion more egalitarian, more equally operating institutions, it would give people options, and they would have a range of choices so that they could realize things that they now can't. I mean, it's hard to imagine how bad things are for some people in the United States. So that you have a child who, in order to go to school, has to traverse, city blocks where there might be drug people with guns, and I mean where you have people who are shot, or gangs, or where their physical safety is in danger, and they do that to get to a school that has not only 20-year-old textbooks, but armed guards because of the violence that's in the schools, and in a situation where there's no resources and people simply don't care, or there are warehouses for people who can't, for these children. So even if they make through, and in neighborhoods where police and fire won't come because they're so dangerous, and to talk then about that child having, being personally responsible for their own situation is where things are in the United States. So it's
if I may, I think I might not have been very clear, but what I mean is that if you want institutional change, institutions are not abstract categories.
Oh, no, I agree with that.
Institutions are actually persons who reinforce these institutional categories or our institutional thinking. So I would like to think that you rather are arguing that.
Yeah, but I would disagree with persons, right? Because I think institutions are also, it's true there are persons in institutions, but there are also things like professional norms. There are things like education. There are those are institutional arrangements that affect the persons within the institutions, and it's those things that I think that all of that actually has to be addressed. It can't be just an individual person's responsibility.
Okay. I think we're about to finish then. And we'd like to thank you, Margaret, for coming and for giving this interesting
Well, thank you
presentation. Thank you for the
coming.
discussion. Yes.